Hello, I'm Richard Parker. Thank you very much for joining me on this icy Wednesday night. I'm excited to kind of share some of my research that I've been doing for my master's program in history at Western Kentucky University. So this picture was taken in the early 1900s, but it's still relevant to kind of what I'm going to be talking about today because it shows roustabouts loading cargo on a steamboat. And during the antebellum period, there was a lot of these jobs would have been performed by slaves or free African Americans. I would like to share this song. This song was as part of the special collections at the McCracken County Library. And I originally did a similar presentation to the Jackson Purchase Historical Society. And one of our members actually took this song and had it arranged by some musicians here in Western Kentucky, J.W. and Amanda Groves. So I would like to play this for you all. So it was a very nice rendition of kind of what we're going to be talking about today. The McCracken County Library has an excellent collection that really relates to a lot of the rivers that we're going to be discussing today. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to check out some sometimes once the libraries reopen to see some of the interesting resources they have. So where did this research kind of start? So 2 semesters ago in one of my master's history classes at Western Kentucky, we discussed African American sailors on the Atlantic Ocean and how they were able to earn higher pay and even earn respect aboard their respected ships. And so I initially kind of started looking for how free African Americans in the South worked on steamboats, but then that's kind of when this research took me to the steamboat and rivers as being kind of the interstates for the Underground Railroad. And this map here, as you can see, running right up kind of in the course of the Mississippi and Ohio here is where, of course, Paducah's here, Cairo, Owensboro. But if you follow this path here out of the south, it runs right along the Ohio River. So that's really going to be a lot of where this presentation is going to be heading today. So another interesting part that I found is just kind of the number of slaves that were here in McCracken County and also in the Purchase area here in Kentucky. So if you look here in McCracken County in 1825, there were 73 slaves, 1830, 87, 1835, 349. Then by 1840, 549. So a lot of these slaves were in agriculture, but as we kind of get into this presentation, you'll kind of see the jobs that they were able to obtain in the steamboat trade, which is, of course, what Paducah is known for during this time. So this chart here, and I apologize, it's kind of a hard scan to see, so I try to transcribe it over here the best I can. But you can see here, this is the total population here in McCracken County. And I kind of did the percentages here. So 1830, there's 11% of the county is made up of slave population. 1840, that's 16%. And by 1850, that goes all the way up to 15. And then right before the Civil War in 1860, there's 1,700 slaves with a population of about 8,600. And that's a 20% of the population would have been enslaved. And that's just here in McCracken County. And you can kind of see here from this presentation, or from this chart here, all the different counties here in the purchase area and the slave population for their respective years. So why is this research important? Slaves were initially transported by steamboat into parts of the South and then later into Texas and Arkansas. But also free African Americans and slaves played a pivotal role in performing the hardest task upon a lot of these steamboats. So some of the positions that they would have worked in is deckhands, chambermaids, cooks, porters, and stewards, providing the ship's necessary labor, which allowed its white passengers to travel in ease. Slaves were on board from the emergence of the steamboat and then all the way up, continue into its the latter part of its trade. And often how this worked is slaves were leased to the steamboat owner. Typically, if there wasn't enough filled for a slave holder to have in their own property, they could lease them to the captain of the boat, and or out in some instances that I found, the captain themselves or the owner of the steamboat purchased slaves for the ship. So free African Americans were also on board. And this kind of adds a dynamic to the Underground Railroad, too, which I'm going to discuss a little later on in the presentation. And this was one of the few means of employment that allowed free men and women to travel the nation. The river systems and the steamboats throughout the Ohio Valley and the South provided African Americans access to a world beyond the plantations, which in turn offered some slaves passage to freedom. So an example of this is Nelson Collins, and he lived here in Paducah, and he was a free African American who worked on various steamboats in several different rows. And in his travels, he reported traveling up the Ohio River all the way to Louisville, and then on the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans. So steamboats likewise provided slaves accessibility to places of freedom and free African Americans as a way to secure employment not afforded to them in communities throughout the South. So free African Americans like Collins also helped and provided slaves passage and advice on how to escape via the river systems. A lot of these free African Americans got off the steamboats and went into these river port cities and really learned the logistics of the cities themselves, also including making connections there with a lot of the local people. And then, of course, they also provided information about upcoming towns and parts of the towns that would be friendly to slaves and free African Americans. So this illustration here kind of shows the cotton packets, and these steamboats played an essential role in linking the North and the South by transporting the South's raw materials and foods to markets in the North. So exports such as tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rice were traded for finished goods, both domestic and foreign. The riverways in the South provided steamboats carrying cottons, which are dubbed cotton packets, a much less intensive journey than carrying the large, bulky bales of cotton on wagon. And in addition to these cotton packets, they could also bank near adjoining cotton fields, and then they could be loaded, which were typically loaded by slaves. And these cotton packets contain thousands of bales of cotton destined for northern markets via the Ohio River tributaries and then also the Mississippi River. So just to kind of put this into perspective, in a keelboat, this would take nearly 4 months to travel from New Orleans to the Falls of Ohio near Louisville. And if you compare this to the slowest steamboat, which could travel at 50 miles a day, and then by the mid-1820s, steamboats could double those numbers. And in the 1820, the first trip from New Orleans to Louisville took 1 month, And by the 1840s, the same trip took less than a week. So this is an extremely fast way of travel compared to just using a standard boat. So how many African Americans worked on steamboats? So over somewhere in between over 20,000 laborers at the mid-century, which included at least 2,000 free African Americans and 3,000 slaves. So that's a pretty high number for an industry. So African Americans who worked in the cotton, sugar, and tobacco markets moved and loaded tens of thousands of pounds of these agricultural commodities on board steamboats, and then offloaded these goods in river port cities they visited. The river port cities themselves gave enslaved African Americans a network of people who would help them relocate or gain new identities. The total number of enslaved steamboat workers is unknown, but according to Thomas Buchanan, who's kind of one of the leading experts on the steamboat in terms of passage for slaves, writes that hundreds, if not thousands, of fugitives rode the decks of the steamboats to freedom. Enslaved steamboat workers created these networks with local free and enslaved African Americans and sometimes whites to provide runaways with a place to hide until they could be moved to the next location via the river. Sometimes this was on board a steamer and sometimes it was on a rowboat. This crucial link provided thousands of slaves access to their freedom via steamboats and helped sympathetic African Americans and whites in river port cities. African American steamboat workers knew the schedules and which boats officers needed workers without worrying about whether or not they were enslaved or free. A lot of times in industry today, companies will easily kind of step around the rules in order to get the job done, and this was very much alive too in a lot of these river port cities. And some of these steamboat captains could care less if they were enslaved or free African Americans, just as long as they were willing to work. So it's very important to note when we're talking about how this industry operated. So networking in cities. So the busy river port cities like Paducah, Louisville, Cairo, Covington provided African American steamboat workers with considerable networks with local people. They often interacted with other African Americans, spending their leisure times in boarding houses, shops, saloons, and city jails. This fraternization helped steamboat workers establish relationships and spend their own money as they pleased. So one example of this is Madison Henderson. Henderson's master allowed him to live apart because of his work on the steamer, the Augustine. Enslaved steamboat workers like Henderson obtained a substantial amount of information about other river port cities and built networks with people in those communities. Some steamboat owners paid the slaveholders directly for the slave wages. And then in some cases, some of the slaveholders requested that the slave be paid so they wouldn't have to worry about obtaining the payment. So many slaves were able to leave the farms they worked on Sundays. This is what is referred to as the Sunday wage, evenings, or even holidays to earn their own wages. So this money aided escaped slaves and allowed them to blend in with steamboat passengers as free African Americans when they were traveling. So what type of work did enslaved and free African Americans do on the ships? As I kind of mentioned earlier, this work would have been cooks, stewards, barbers, waiters, and deckhands. The cabin crews were expected to dress in clean white shirts, comb their hair, and be a visible presence of the high quality the steamboat provided to its passengers. Slaves also learned how to interact with whites, learning more about the world outside of their confinement. Slaves could also earn tips from the passengers and most often kept this money for themselves. So this newfound knowledge aided them and others in a sudden attempt at any escape in which one of the many river port cities the steamboat visited might offer, which I'll talk about 4 instances in the later of this presentation where that kind of sudden moment occurred. Slaves were also able to listen to conversations and gain information about the logistics of upcoming river port cities from what they heard from passengers in dining halls, on the deck, or anywhere else. Another occupation that African Americans, free and enslaved workers, worked in was that of the fireman. The fireman was the most dangerous position on a steamer because if a boiler got too hot, it could explode, killing the fireman and even worse, the passengers and sinking the ship. So slaves did not perform this task on older ships because of the dangers of the boilers killing the fireman and the ship's owner having to pay liability to the slaveholder. So to offset this danger, a lot of the ship's owners would only employ Irishmen, and they were preferred to slaves on old and worn out ships because since their deaths would bring no financial loss to the management. So really interesting, a lot of American, if you're familiar with American history, really interesting point there. So where did slaves not travel? It's really interesting because I actually lived in Covington for 3 years and I kind of didn't have any idea about this, but this is a really interesting point here that I learned during the course of this research. So the use of slaves on steamboats rarely occurred above Cincinnati on the Ohio River and above St. Louis on the Mississippi River. The proximity of free states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois contribute immensely to the slaveholders' reluctancy to allow their slaves to travel into these anti-slavery areas. Lewis C. Hunter, another well-known writer about the importance of the steamboat and the Underground Railroad, discusses that the risk of losing slaves by escape at the ports of free states, especially along the ports along the upper Ohio, such as Cincinnati, where anti-slavery sentiment was strong, and of that being held liable to the owners for their value was too great to make their use advisable on vessels plying this part of the river. To curtail the chances of escapee and to please the slaveholders, steamboat captains often left slaves in custody in Louisville or Covington until the steamboat could come back to pick them up. And in custody, they mean in a holding house, which would have been much like a jail. So Hunter points out that some ports along the way in Indiana and Illinois were often sympathetic to the slave trade and did not pose any significant risk of slaves being transported to freedom by the people who supported abolition. So it's really interesting to think about because I'm going to give some examples here of where two slaves were able to escape through southern Illinois and find their way to freedom. There's also a free African-American community called Miller Grove that's in southern Illinois that helped aid some slaves to freedom there on their Underground Railroad. And you can find some of that information off of the Shawnee National Forces website. It's really interesting history. Kind of what were these river port cities like? So this is really interesting because this photo here kind of shows Cincinnati on its side. And then, of course, it's taken from, if you're familiar with Covington or Newport, it's taken on that side of the river. So, of course, Covington would have been to where it's kind of the last stop for steamboat owners to stop and release their slaves there before they travel on up the Ohio River. The busy docks and urban levees of western cities created opportunities for slaves to pass as free workers or even to book passage with white passengers. Slaves were drawn to the river not only because of the possibility of quick transportation to the north, but also because they knew that a sympathetic boatman may help them. And there's an example that I'll talk about along of this. So evidence can be added to the statement by examining the reward posters that are seeking the return of their slaves who escaped via the steamboat. So this is an example here of one, and this is comes from the New Orleans area, and it January 31st, 1853. So it lists in the reward section that a slave by the name of Edmund left from his work on the E. Howard steamboat, and the reward advertisement and others along with it provides a concise look into the steamboat as a means of escape for slaves. And I found several of these, and it's really interesting when they mention the steamboat, because a lot of times it's what I was talking about earlier in the presentation, the slaveholder leased it to the steamboat for work. In the course of the research, if you're a historian, you know there's always that one thing that you find that's like, wow, that's exactly kind of what I was looking for. And I'm a big fan of newspapers.com. And fortunately, I was on there just kind of putting in some search terms, and I stumbled across this here, and this comes from the Louisville Daily Courier, and it was published in 1854. And I think it really speaks to what this presentation is about. And so it kind of highlights insurance for slaveholders when their slave is working on a steamboat. So you can look here. There's two pictures of an escape a slave here, implying that it's a runaway slave. So what were some protective measures that slaveholders took? Because this was known as a threat, especially as we get into 1840s and 1850s. So slaveholders were aware of the threat that the steamboat posed to escaping slaves, and measures were passed in Louisiana and Mississippi preventing free African Americans to enter certain cities as they could aid escaping slaves. The steamboat captains and river port authorities took measures to stop runaways from gaining access to the passage on steamboats. In some river port cities, patrols occurred daily, and runaway advertisements with descriptions of physical features were posted near every port. The papers of free African Americans were also, and sometimes, checked when they boarded a steamer and held by the clerk in case a check needed to be executed to help stop runaways. Despite these risks, many slaves were still willing to risk capture and make a quick getaway on a steamboat destined for Cincinnati or Pittsburgh. In light of these measures, many steamboat captains and owners took help where they could find it, whether it was from a free African American or an escaping slave. This is some of the some screenshots here of the actual acts that I found that speak to the measures that a lot of these local river port cities in Mississippi and Louisiana took in order to protect the slave owners' interests. So, who were some of the slaves that escaped? So, there's several very interesting stories here, and I only included a few of them, but there's a lot of recurring themes that occur here, and many of these slaves come from the Deep South. They found passage on steamboats. They were relatively great workers, really gained the trust of the other workers aboard, the steamboat captain, and their own slave holder. And they were able to just kind of see an opportunity and took that opportunity. And it's really interesting because a lot of this occurred in the Ohio River, close to our area here in Paducah, Western Kentucky, and Southern Illinois. So the first one is William Wells Brown, and he had just an absolutely, if you really start to research this, he's really kind of the most exciting escape that took place. And this took place in Cincinnati, and his master took him to Cincinnati on board a steamboat. And as you can imagine, during this time, I showed the picture of Cincinnati, but it was just a bustling town. There's a lot of people there. And I guess a good way to picture this is with all the steamboats docked, that's very much like maybe pulling up to a rest station on the 4th of July. There's just people everywhere. There's cars, there's buses, there's semis today. But during this time, a steamboat port or a river port would very much be along those same lines. So it's very easy to blend in and very easy to kind of maneuver your way around with all the chaos going on. So Wells, as soon as the boat docked, Brown picked up his belongings and blended in with those passengers disembarking the boat, and found his way to freedom. And this comes from the busy Cincinnati dock, and I could just imagine this because living in Covington, I used to go to Cincinnati quite, and I could just imagine Brown walking up the bank there on up into the city. All right, so the next one has a really interesting story, and John Sella Martin. Martin was leased out to a steamboat captain and worked up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, but I guess very similar to, not quite as cold, but similar to night. It was a very cold night on the Ohio River, and the Ohio River actually started to freeze, and so it forced the steamer that Martin was aboard to make an unexpected stop near Cairo, Illinois. And Martin was able to maneuver his way off the ship, and he was he was able to work his way through Cairo and managed to board a train heading to St. Louis, where he was able to find some sympathetic people and find his way to freedom. So later, he became a well-known abolitionist and traveled to Great Britain to build support for the Union during the Civil War. And he eventually saved enough money to purchase his sister and her 2 children. And he actually became acquainted with Abraham Lincoln, and that was part of the how he got the designation to go to Great Britain to lobby on the behalf of the United States. So really interesting and great story, real close to us here in Paducah. And 2, I just want to add, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the history from the Underground Railroad is of course, it wasn't written down because a lot of people didn't want to basically get caught for aiding slaves. So a lot of the actual history comes from escaped slaves themselves, which I find just really interesting. And there's a lot of narratives that once slaves made it to the North, they were able to record their stories. And something too that's very interesting. It seems like they all became abolitionists or preachers. So another escapee that I would like to talk about is a slave by the name of Tom. And Tom was a Louisiana slave that escaped his master's plantation via a skiff, which is like a little rowboat, only to be captured by a lumberman near island number 95. If you're familiar with the Mississippi River, all the little islands are numbered. And this lumberman enslaved Tom, and Tom also escaped with 2 other men. So Tom was able to maneuver his way away from the lumberman and stole another skiff, and then found a flatboat carrying coal. And when he was on this flatboat, he told that the captain that he was originally from Pittsburgh and had been working as a cook as a free man and was kicked off a steamboat for fighting with a steward. So really interesting story there. The captain told him that he couldn't pick up African Americans on his boat. But fortunately for Tom, some of the other African Americans that were aboard the boat intervened and told the captain that they knew him because they had seen him at other river port cities and were familiar with him. So Tom was able to board and was eventually hired by the captain and traveled up and down the river, but was eventually able to work his way on some other steamboats and work the steamboat trade to New Orleans, kind of up and down the Mississippi. And then eventually he was able to book passage on the steamboat named Empress. And again, he traveled to Cairo, where he was eventually able to find his freedom. So, this is the second story that I found that involved the steamboat and the rivers, but linked right back here close to Paducah in southern Illinois. All right, and the last one that I would like to highlight is Henry Bibb. And this is another really important and interesting story that's been kind of obscured, that I really feel really kind of highlights the importance of the steamboat and the role it played in the Underground Railroad. So Bibb had asked permission to seek work from a slaveholder near the Ohio River, but found a person along the river who was willing to help him with passage to Indiana. And of course, again, southern Indiana was much like southern Illinois, where a lot of people just they weren't willing to help slaves, much like unless above St. Louis or Cincinnati. So in Madison, Indiana, he was able to board a steamboat that was destined to Cincinnati at night. And luckily, he was able to kind of hide away from others on the boat, so he wouldn't be questioned why an African American was traveling to Cincinnati. And this steamer traveled up. He hid. He kind of just stayed away from everyone else, and it landed in Cincinnati at 9 o'clock the next morning. And he kind of was still hid and waited until most of the passengers had disembarked before he walked off the steamboat. And then again, Bibb walked right up Broadway and found a group of boys And through the use of some indirect questioning, he was able to find the location of a free African American man. And this man was willing to help Bibb with travels to Canada. And then later in Canada, Bibb was able to save up enough money to come back and purchase his wife and daughter. But, I really think that all four of these stories kind of highlight how spontaneous a lot of these escapes were, and how quickly, when the opportunity presented themselves, they were able to take advantage through their wit and find freedom. So that's all I have. So thank you again. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you have some questions, I'm happy to answer. I did forget, here's some of the references. There's a lot of history on this, and there's a lot of history again at the McCracken County Library, and I really always encourage people to check it out.
Richard, this is Nathan. Lynn.
Hey, bud.
I just wanted to say great job.
Thank
you. Really well done, and thank you for utilizing the library's resources. We really appreciate your support of what we do at the library. So thank you for that, friend.
Well, thank you. I couldn't be as far in life and know as much about history if it wasn't for the McCracken County Library and Nathan Lynn. Any questions? I'm happy to answer any. And two, I just want to add to there is a ton of research that could be done in this field. It was really fascinating, and I wish if I had my druthers, I would be a history student forever. But you have to grow up and get a job. So if we have any students of history here, there's a lot left to explore.
We had somebody who wanted to know if you found stories for using the Tennessee and the Cumberland to get across into Southern Illinois.
So yes, there again, those were just kind of, I really focused this heavily on the Ohio River, but there is stories too, and it's real interesting too, because along in what's now land between the lakes on the Cumberland side, there was actually a lot of slaves who were enslaved in the pig iron industry there, and slaves would also ride the steamboats to deliver pig iron along various ports there in the Cumberland, and then on up into the Ohio River. And I didn't find any exact, kind of like I did with the last four that I presented, but there's a lot of hints that I'm positive that that escapes occurred on the Cumberland River as well. And two, oh yeah, and speaking to the Tennessee, there was a significant amount of research too that linked plantations in Alabama up into our area via the river.
What movies would you share for us to watch to get more into the history?
I really like 12 Years a Slave. I think that's a really powerful narrative. There's also, you can also read Solomon Northup's biography that he wrote. And again, he was a free African American who was enslaved. What is actually called the reverse Underground Railroad, and this is where slavers would go into the North and capture African Americans, and most of the time they were free, and enslave them back into and sell them in the South. And they would usually try to take them as far south as possible. But it's really interesting, his story, and it actually shows a clip of him on a steamboat heading to the South in the Atlantic Ocean. So the steamboat really was a means of travel in both instances.
This is Bruce Dobbins. I want to recommend Harriet. If you want to know more about Underground Railroad and the great work Harriet Tubman did during the time of enslavement in America.
Thanks, Bruce. Bruce is the one too who I had your name on the notes, but about who organized the song that I played there in the beginning. So thank you very much, Bruce.
I have one more. I'm quite interested what got you into, really wanting to dive more deep into the history, and then also, what would you recommend? I mean, I know we all have our different individual statuses here, but to keep us grounded and also to bring more awareness of this history as well.
So I just kind of got interested in, I heard a lot of people here in Paducah talk about the Underground Railroad, and there's a lot of stories, and I still hope one day to research more of kind of some of the things I've heard. So that was kind of a catalyst. To the map that I showed you at the very beginning, that's from the National Geographic. And I've always wondered, why is Paducah on that map? Where are these stories? So that was interesting. To kind of speak to just kind of staying grounded. Again, the libraries, they really have a lot of resources that are really good to explore. They're also I'm the vice president of the Jackson Purchase Historical Society. In our journals, we really do a good job of bringing life to the diversity of our region. The Kentucky Historical Society's got a great journal as well, and so does the Filson Historical Society in Louisville. They have a lot of this research and information, and typically all those journals, there's articles that kind of speak to the diversity of Kentucky.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
We had somebody who wanted to know if you found stories of moving the Cherokee by river in the 1830s.
So if this is speaking to the Trail of Tears, yes, that did occur. Actually, there's two historical markers that are now here in Paducah. If you come around the flood, if you drive down the riverfront and come around the stage, right when you're coming back up the hill, right before you go under the flood wall, to the left is two historical markers that were just installed about a year and a half ago. That the National Park Service, in collaboration with some other federal agencies, installed, and they speak to that, because you're actually looking out and seeing, where that traveled. But there's actually a site too, and again, what's now known as Land Between the Lakes, to where they're installing a similar historical area to that's going to overlook the river. So yes, so slave women did work on boats too, the stewardess, and then also they were often the ones who would clean cabins as well. And again, that's another great field of research there alone, is just researching the role that women played on the steamboat. I could imagine there's a lot of really great information that a historian could spend some time researching and really find an outstanding paper or presentation. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. It really means the world to me.